The day my mother took her last, shuddering breath in that cold, sterile hospital room. A room that smelled of antiseptic and finality. My world didn't just end, it dissolved. It broke down into a silent, gray, and suffocating fog of grief. My father, a man I had always known to be as solid and unmovable as the granite mountains of New England, collapsed into a hard plastic chair by her bedside. His large, capable builder's hands that could frame a house and tame a piece of stubborn oak, now looked small and useless as they covered his face. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking grief that was terrifying to behold in a man who never showed emotion. I, a terrified and shattered 15-year-old girl, did the only thing I could think of. I went to him. It was pure instinct, a primal pull toward the only other person on the planet who was experiencing the exact same tectonic shift in their soul. In our small, broken family of 3, we were now just 2, and I tried to bridge the new, gaping, silent chasm that had just opened between us. I reached out and tried to put my arms around his shaking shoulders, to offer the only comfort I had to give, my presence, my shared blood, my shared loss. But he flinched away from my touch as if I were a hot iron. He recoiled from me, physically, violently, pushing my hands away with a guttural sound of disgust. He looked up at me then, his face a crumpled, tear-streaked mask of disbelief. And his eyes, which had always been a distant, cloudy gray, were now on fire with a terrifying, bottomless, and laser-focused rage I had never, ever seen before. And he screamed. It wasn't just a shout. It was a roar of pure, undiluted agony that seemed to rip from the very core of his being. He screamed a single sentence that echoed off the polished linoleum floors and became the foundational blueprint for the next 10 years of my life. He screamed, "This is all your fault." Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Clara. I'm 75 years old, and I live in a small, quiet coastal town in North Carolina, a place where the air smells of salt and pine. I moved here 20 years ago, specifically to be near the ocean. I find the sound of the waves to be a great comfort. It's a constant, rhythmic sound of washing away, of erasure, of starting new. It's a peace I had to fight very, very hard to find. A peace I had to build for myself, one grain of sand, one painful memory at a time. The story I'm about to tell you is one I have kept buried in the deepest, most silent vault of myself for most of my adult life. It's a story about grief, the ugly, twisted, monstrous kind of grief that doesn't bring people together in shared sorrow, but instead turns them into weapons against each other. It's the story of how my father's heart broke into 1,000 sharp, jagged pieces, and how he used those pieces, for a decade, to systematically cut and bleed the life and spirit out of mine. I became his living scapegoat, the walking, breathing embodiment of his rage and his loss. And for 10 long years, lost in the fog of my own grief and my desperate, childish, all-consuming need for his love, I believed his narrative. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was to blame, that I was, somehow, fundamentally and irrevocably at fault. I never spoke of it, not in detail, not the full, suffocating, day-to-day truth of it. Friends and family, the few I had left from my old life, saw the growing rift between us over the years. They just assumed it was the sad, natural, unavoidable consequence of a shared, unbearable tragedy. A father and daughter who just couldn't find their way back to each other after the heart of their family was ripped out. They didn't know the depth of it. They didn't know about the daily, soul-crushing criticism, the relentless emotional cruelty, the slow, methodical erasure of my own self in a desperate, unending attempt to please a man who could not, and would not, be pleased. They didn't know because I was too ashamed to tell them. The shame was a physical gag in my mouth, a heavy stone on my heart that made it difficult to breathe. But I have learned, in my 75 years, a very important lesson about secrets and shame. Carrying a secret for someone else is a heavy, unpaid, and thankless job. And I am finally ready to retire. I am ready to put the stone down. Before I begin, I'd be so grateful if you would press that like button and subscribe to my channel. It's a small act, but in the context of this story, it feels enormous to me. It's an act of bearing witness. It's a hand reaching out across the decades of silence. It tells me that you are listening, and that it is never, ever too late for a woman to finally find and use her own voice, even if it trembles. Thank you for that. Now let me tell you about the glue that held our fragile family together, and what happened when she dissolved, leaving us to fall apart. To understand why everything shattered so completely, you first have to understand the woman who held all the pieces together with the quiet strength of her love. My mother, Eleanor. She was not a loud or dramatic person. She was the opposite. She was the quiet, steady, gravitational center of our small family universe. If our family was a country with a difficult unspoken language, she was the only one who was fluent. She was our diplomat, our translator, our emotional core. She had a rare and precious gift for understanding the unspoken, for navigating the treacherous, often choppy, emotional currents of our home, especially the difficult, coded, and often stormy emotional language of my father. My father, Richard, was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. Not then. He was not inherently cruel. But he was a difficult man, a man forged in the hardship of a poor post-depression childhood, and hardened by a life of relentless physical labor. He was a man of his generation, a man from a time and place where emotions were considered a private affliction, a form of weakness not to be displayed or discussed. He was a contractor, a builder of houses. He was a man who understood the properties of wood and stone and concrete, a man who could look at a blueprint and see a finished home with almost X-ray vision. But he was completely, utterly baffled by the interior architecture of the human heart. His own heart was a locked room, a place he rarely visited himself, and I think over the years he had lost the key. His love was a practical, tangible thing. It was a language of action, not words. It was never communicated directly. It was in the solid, well-built roof over our heads that never leaked during a thunderstorm. It was in the good, plentiful food on the table every single night. It was in the well-maintained car in the driveway that always started, even on the coldest New England winter mornings. It was in the way he would, without a word, check the air in my bicycle tires before I went for a ride down the street. It was a love expressed through a fierce and silent sense of duty. But it was never in a hug after a scraped knee, or a shared easy laugh, or a simple 3-word sentence, "I love you." He communicated, for the most part, through a gruff, impenetrable, and often intimidating silence. This silence wasn't always angry, but it was vast, and as a child, I often found myself lost in it. And my mother, she was his translator. She was the bridge between his silent, stoic world and my sensitive, emotional one. I was a quiet child, a bookish child, and my father's gruffness, his loud, stomping presence after a long day of wrestling with lumber and concrete, often frightened me. I would shrink away from him, my shoulders hunched, trying to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. My mother, with her incredible emotional intelligence, would see this, and she would become the bridge. "Your father is just tired, honey," she would say later in the kitchen, her hand warm and reassuring on my shoulder as I dried the dishes. "He had a hard day with a difficult client today. He was asking me earlier if you finished that new library book you were so excited about. He said he saw you reading it on the porch and you looked just like I used to." She had this magical ability to find the hidden kernel of affection in his silence and translate it for me, to make it something I could understand and hold on to. She gave his silent love a voice, and she would do the same for him, translating me to him, making my quiet world accessible to his practical one. Clara was so proud of the A she got on her spelling test. "Richard," she would tell him at the dinner table, her voice gentle but firm, refusing to let my small victory go unnoticed. She would gently coax a rare, grudging nod of approval from him, a slight softening of his stern face that felt to my young heart like winning an Olympic medal. She was our conduit, our buffer, the peacemaker. She absorbed his dark moods. She managed his short temper. She created a space of warmth and emotional safety for me in a house that could have otherwise felt very cold and very lonely. Our relationship, my father's and mine, was not close. Not in the way I saw my friends' easy, joking relationships with their fathers. But it was peaceful. It was functional. It was a fragile, delicate ecosystem, a beautiful, hand-blown glass ornament, entirely dependent on her constant, tireless, and often invisible efforts to hold it together. Our little family was a three-legged stool. It was steady, it was balanced, as long as all three legs were in place. But when she was suddenly, shockingly taken from us, the stool didn't just wobble. It collapsed into a pile of sharp, splintered kindling. The diagnosis came when I was 14. Ovarian cancer. It was a quiet, insidious thief. It had done its work silently, without any major symptoms, for a long time. By the time they found it, it was already advanced. Stage 4. The doctors, with their kind, sad eyes, gave her a year. Maybe less. That year was a slow-motion nightmare. It was like living in a house where you knew, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that the foundation was cracking, and that soon, very soon, everything you had ever known was going to come crashing down around your ears. My father, he simply could not cope. The news shattered his world, a world he had built on the illusion of control and predictability. A leaky roof he could fix. A faulty foundation he could shore up. A crooked wall he could tear down and rebuild. But this invisible enemy inside the woman he loved, it was beyond his comprehension, beyond his ability to control with his hands. And so he retreated. He retreated even further into his shell of angry, frightened silence. He refused to talk about it. He couldn't even bring himself to say the word cancer. He would only refer to it as her sickness. He threw himself into his work with a frantic, desperate, almost manic energy, leaving the house before I woke up in the morning, and coming home long after dark, his face a grim, stony mask, smelling of sawdust, and a sorrow so profound it had no name. All of the emotional labor, all of the practical, day-to-day caregiving fell to me. I was a child, a high school freshman, trying to navigate the terrifying, unfamiliar landscape of my mother's illness, while also trying to manage the silent, simmering, and unpredictable rage of my father. My life became a series of hospital visits, of hushed, hurried conversations with doctors whose pitying eyes I couldn't bear to meet. I would come home from school, and the first thing I would do, before even taking off my coat, was go to my mother's room. The big master bedroom, once so full of life, had been transformed into a sick room, with a hospital bed, and the faint, sweet, medicinal smell of impending death. I would sit by her bed for hours. We would talk, when she had the strength. We talked about everything and nothing. About the book I was reading in English class. About the squirrels in the backyard. About her childhood. As she grew weaker, I would read to her, just as she had done for me when I was a little girl. I read her Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, her favorites. I would brush her thinning, beautiful blonde hair, my hands as gentle as I could make them. I would hold a cup of water with a straw to her dry lips. I would help her to the bathroom, my skinny arms wrapped around her frail, shrinking body. I was her nurse, her confidante, her companion. I was a 14-year-old girl, trying to be the rock for the woman who had always, always been mine. And in those quiet, sacred, and heartbreaking moments with her, holding her hand, I felt a strength and a purpose I didn't know I had. I was her daughter. This was my duty. This was my love. But when my father's car pulled into the driveway in the evening, the atmosphere in the house would instantly curdle. The quiet peace of my mother's room would be replaced by a toxic, unspoken dread. He couldn't stand to be in the room with her for more than a few minutes at a time. He couldn't bear to see her weakness, her frailty. It was as if her illness was a personal failure on his part, a badly built project he couldn't fix with a hammer and nails. It was a testament to his own powerlessness, and he hated it. He hated the feeling. His grief was so immense, so terrifying to him, that it had no outlet. So it curdled. It soured. It turned into a hot, molten resentment that simmered just below the surface. And that resentment, like a cornered, wounded animal, began to look for a target to lash out at. I remember one evening so clearly. It has stayed with me all these years, a perfect, terrible diorama in my memory. It was about a month before she died. I had helped my mother into a fresh nightgown, a pretty one with little blue flowers that I had carefully, lovingly ironed for her. I was sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her thin, cool hand. We were looking through an old photo album, and she was smiling, a faint, tired but genuine smile, as we looked at a picture of me as a toddler, covered head to toe in mud from the backyard. My father walked into the room. He didn't come all the way in. He just stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. He wasn't looking at his dying wife, smiling a rare smile. He was looking at me, holding her hand, sharing a moment of intimacy with her that he could no longer have. And the look in his eyes was one I had never seen before. It was a look of pure, cold, undiluted poison. It was a look of blame. It was a look of jealousy. "What are you doing?" he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You're tiring her out. Leave her be." "No, Richard," my mother said, her voice a weak, papery whisper, but with a spark of her old, protective fire. "She's a comfort to me, my sweet girl, my Clara." He ignored her completely, as if she hadn't spoken, as if she were already a ghost. He just kept staring at me, his eyes boring into me, pinning me to the bed. In that moment, I think the narrative in his broken, grieving mind was already being written, the terrible, twisted story he would tell himself for the next 10 years. The narrative where I, the healthy one, the one who was surviving, was somehow responsible. Where I had somehow failed to protect her, or was even, in some twisted, Oedipal way, a replacement for her that he refused to accept. It was an irrational, insane thought, but grief is not rational. And my father's grief was a burgeoning, dangerous madness. He was looking for someone to blame for the unbearable, crushing pain of his world falling apart. And in that moment, in that doorway, he found me. The day of my mother's funeral was a gray, drizzling, miserable day in late autumn, a day where the sky itself seemed to be weeping. The church was filled with the familiar faces of our small town, people whose lives my mother had touched with her quiet kindness. After the service, a crowd of neighbors and friends came back to our house, filling it with their hushed condolences and the heavy, cloying scent of lilies and the baked ham and scalloped potatoes people had brought. To this day, the combination of those smells, the sweetness of death and the saltiness of feigned comfort, makes me feel physically ill. People would come up to me, their faces etched with a deep, uncomfortable pity, and they would pat my arm and tell me how sorry they were. They would tell me I was a good daughter, that I had been so strong for my mother, so brave. And then, almost every single one of them, with the best of intentions, would say some version of the same terrible thing. "You must take care of your father now, Clara. He's going to need you. You're all he has left. You must be his rock now." And I believed them. I was a child, adrift in a turbulent sea of adult grief, and I clung to their words like a life raft. Their words became my new purpose. I made a silent, solemn promise to my mother as I stood by her open grave, the cold drizzle soaking my thin black dress and plastering my hair to my scalp. "I'll take care of him, Mama. I'll be good. I'll make you proud. I promise." It was a sacred vow, made with the purest of intentions, a promise that would nearly cost me my soul and would define the entirety of my young adulthood. My father's scream in the hospital was not an isolated incident of grief-stricken madness. I now see it for what it was, the declaration of a war I didn't even know I was fighting, a war in which I was the sole, unsuspecting enemy soldier. The 10 years that followed were a slow, methodical, and brutally effective campaign of emotional abuse, a masterclass in how to dismantle a person from the inside out without ever leaving a visible mark on their skin. Life in our house, once my sanctuary, became a tense and treacherous minefield. His grief, unable to find a healthy, rational outlet, did not dissipate. Instead, it fixated on me with the unwavering intensity of a laser beam. I was the living, breathing, walking reminder of his loss. I looked like her. I had her eyes, her smile, the same way of tilting my head when I was listening. But I was not her. And that, in his warped, grieving mind, was my greatest and most unforgivable sin. I was a constant, painful echo of a song he could no longer hear. The criticism was a daily, relentless drumbeat, a form of water torture designed to erode my confidence and my sense of self. It started, most ferociously, in the kitchen, which had always been my mother's domain, her kingdom. Cooking was the first and most enduring battleground. My mother had been a wonderful, intuitive cook, the kind who never needed a recipe, who cooked with love and instinct. I, in a desperate, almost frantic attempt to appease him, to fill the gaping, mother-shaped hole in our lives, tried to replicate her dishes. I would spend hours in the kitchen after school, my homework spread out on the table, poring over her handwritten notes in her old, spattered recipe book, trying to decipher her cryptic instructions. But nothing I ever made was right. It was a test I could never pass. "This is dry," he would say, pushing a plate of roast chicken away after a single, cursory bite, his face a mask of disappointment. "Your mother's was always moist. She knew how to let it rest. You've ruined a perfectly good bird. You put too much salt in the soup." Again, he would sigh, pushing his bowl away. "I've told you about that. Your mother knew I had to watch my blood pressure. It's like you're not even listening. It's like you don't care. What is this slop?" he asked one night, his voice laced with a theatrical disgust as he looked at a shepherd's pie I had spent an hour preparing, a dish she used to make on cold winter nights. Your mother would never have served something like this. She had standards. She took pride in her home. Each comment was a small, sharp knife twisting in my already wounded heart. I wasn't just failing to please him. In my mind, I was failing my mother's memory, desecrating her legacy with my own clumsy inadequacy. I began to dread dinner time with a sick, anxious fear. It became a nightly tribunal, a public trial where I was always found guilty. I would sit there, my stomach in knots, my own food tasteless in my mouth, just waiting for the inevitable criticism, the sigh of disappointment, the comparison in which I always came up short. The house itself, every corner of it, became another weapon in his arsenal, another stage for my failures. My mother had kept a beautiful, warm, and welcoming home. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with her touch, a vase of wildflowers on the mantelpiece, a colorful afghan she had crocheted, draped over the sofa, the scent of lemon polish. I tried, with a desperate, almost obsessive intensity, to do the same. I cleaned, I dusted, I polished the old wooden furniture until it gleamed. But he found fault in everything. "You missed a spot," he would say, running a finger over a tabletop and then holding it up for my inspection. "A single mote of dust, a testament to my incompetence. This house is going to rack and ruin without her. It's falling apart." He would walk into a room I had just tidied and begin rearranging the furniture with a kind of angry energy, moving chairs and lamps back to the right way, my mother's way, as if my own touch, my own attempt to exist in the space, was a contamination. He was living in a museum dedicated to the memory of his dead wife, and I was the bumbling, inadequate, and unwanted curator. I was a ghost haunting my own home, trying not to disturb the artifacts of a life that was no longer mine. My own grief, my own profound loss of the most important person in my world, was completely and utterly invalidated. It was not allowed to exist. It was a luxury I could not afford. If he caught me crying in my room, a quiet, desperate shedding of tears into my pillow, he would fly into a rage that was terrifying in its cold intensity. "What are you crying for?" he would yell, his voice bouncing off the thin walls of my small bedroom. "You think your tears are going to bring her back? Stop feeling sorry for yourself and make yourself useful. You have no idea what real loss is. You still have a father. I have nothing." His grief was a great, roaring fire that consumed all the oxygen in the house. Mine was a small, flickering candle that he repeatedly, contemptuously snuffed out. There was no room for my pain in the vast cathedral of his. And so I learned to cry in the shower, the sound of the water masking my sobs. I learned to grieve in the deep of the night, silently, so as not to disturb him. My inner world, once a place of books and quiet daydreams and the boundless optimism of youth, became a dark and echoing prison of self-blame and gnawing anxiety. His voice became my inner voice. It was a constant, critical monologue that played on a loop inside my head. You're not good enough. You're failing. You're lazy. You're selfish. It's all your fault. If you were better, if you were more like her, he would not be so unhappy. I began to believe it. I internalized his narrative so completely that it became my own bedrock truth. I would look in the mirror and hate the sad, frightened girl who looked back at me. She was a poor, clumsy imitation of her mother. She was the reason her father was in such constant, unrelenting pain. My entire existence became a desperate, hopeless, all-consuming quest to win his approval, a pathetic attempt to earn a single crumb of the love he had once, through my mother's careful and constant translation, shown me. My social life, the normal, vibrant life of a teenager, withered and died on the vine. How could I bring friends home to that atmosphere of silent, simmering rage? How could I explain my father's moods, his coldness, his contemptuous silences that could suck the very air out of a room? I remember a friend from school, a sweet, bubbly girl named Mary, came over one afternoon to work on a history project. We were sitting on the living room floor, our books spread out around us, laughing about a silly teacher. My father came home early. He walked into the living room, saw us, and he just stood there, staring, his face a thundercloud of disapproval. He didn't say a single word. He just radiated a cold, angry energy that was so palpable, so suffocating, that Mary began to pack up her books almost immediately, her own laughter dying in her throat. I think I should go, she stammered, not looking at me. My mom, she'll be waiting for me. She never came over again, and I never invited anyone else. I became isolated. My world shrank to the four walls of that unhappy house. I finished high school, a quiet, haunted girl who excelled academically because books were my only escape from the misery of my life, but who had no real friends, no social life. I was an old woman in a teenager's body. I lived inside my own head, and it was a very lonely, very critical place to be. I desperately wanted to go to college. It had been my mother's greatest dream for me. She had been saving for it since I was a little girl, a small, dedicated account that she had called Clara's future. But he refused to even consider it. College, he scoffed, when I timidly, nervously, with a heart full of desperate hope, brought it up one evening as I was clearing the dinner dishes. What in God's name do you need college for? To go and fill your head with more useless liberal nonsense. Your place is here. Who's going to look after this house? Who's going to look after me? The unspoken accusation was crystal clear. Wanting a life of my own, a future that did not revolve around serving him and his grief, was the ultimate act of betrayal. It was an abandonment of him and of my sacred duty to the memory of my mother. He had successfully, twistedly, conflated the two. To leave him would be to leave her. So I stayed. I enrolled in a secretarial course at the local community college, something he deemed practical and useful. After I graduated, I got a job as a clerk at a local insurance office. It was a quiet, respectable job. Every Friday, I would cash my paycheck at the bank. And every Friday, I would come home and put most of it, in cash, on the kitchen counter for him to put into the household account. I was paying for groceries and bills. I was, in essence, a tenant in my own childhood home, paying rent for the privilege of being his emotional punching bag. He never hit me. Not once. I want to be very clear about that. He didn't have to. His campaign was one of psychological warfare. The emotional and verbal abuse was so constant, so effective, so soul-destroying, that a physical blow would have been redundant. He was dismantling me, piece by piece, with his words, his silences, his sighs of deep, weary disappointment, and his ever-present, simmering contempt. I remember one specific incident when I was about 20 years old. It feels so small now, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but at the time, it was devastating. It was a perfect encapsulation of my life. I had saved up for months to buy a new dress for the company Christmas party. It was a pretty, dark blue velvet dress. It wasn't flashy or revealing, but it was beautiful. I put it on, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt a flicker of my old self, the girl I had been before my mother died. I felt pretty. It was a feeling so foreign it was almost frightening. When I came downstairs, my coat over my arm, ready to leave, he was sitting in his armchair, reading the newspaper. He looked up at me over the top of the paper, and his eyes, cold and critical, raked over me from head to toe. "Where do you think you're going, dressed like that?" he said, his voice dripping with a disdain that was like acid, shriveling the small, hopeful flower that had just bloomed inside me. "To my office party, Papa," I said, my small spark of confidence already sputtering and dying under his cold gaze. "Dressed like a common tramp," he muttered, turning back to his newspaper, dismissing me completely as if I were a piece of dust he had just noticed and flicked away. "You'll be the talk of the town. You have no respect for your mother's memory, going out looking like that." I went back up to my room. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I just felt a deep, cold, and familiar numbness. I took off the beautiful blue dress, the one I had been so excited about. I hung it in the back of my closet, where I would never wear it. I put on my old, drab, sensible clothes, and I sat on the edge of my bed and didn't go to the party. He won again. He always won. The ghost of my mother, the beautiful, loving woman who had been my greatest champion, was no longer a comfort to me. In his hands, she had become a stick he used to beat me with every single day. I was living a half-life, a gray, colorless, joyless existence, and I saw no way out. The promise I had made at my mother's grave had become a life sentence. The turning point, the moment the 10-year-long brutal winter in my soul finally, blessedly began to thaw, was not a dramatic confrontation. It was not a single explosive event where I finally screamed back at him. My spirit had been so thoroughly dismantled, I no longer had a scream left in me. No, the catalyst for my liberation was a quiet, dusty afternoon, a box of old photographs, and the gentle, unexpected wisdom of a kind stranger. I was 25 years old. A full decade had passed since my mother's death. A decade of my life, a decade of my youth, offered up as a daily, silent sacrifice to his unending, unappeasable grief. He had decided, in one of his unpredictable and tyrannical moods, that it was time to clean out the attic. This was his code, I had come to learn, for purging more of my mother's remaining presence from the house. He couldn't stand the reminders. Her old clothes in a trunk, her books, her keepsakes. They were a constant, silent accusation of the joy that had been stolen from his life. So I was sent up to the hot, stuffy, spiderweb-filled attic with his grim-clipped instructions. "Get rid of all that old junk. Pack it up for the church donation drive. I want it gone by Monday." It was a heartbreaking, soul-crushing task. I felt like an archaeologist excavating my own buried heart. I was touching the fabric of her life, the things her hands had touched, the things she had treasured. I found her old Singer sewing machine, silent under a shroud of white dust. I found her collection of worn-out romance novels, their pages yellowed and smelling of time and vanilla. And then, in a large, sturdy cardboard box, shoved into a dark corner under the eaves, I found a box simply labeled Photos. I sat on the dusty, splintery floorboards of the attic, the slanted afternoon sun cutting a single golden beam through the grime on the small, round window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust mote. And I opened the box. For the next hour, I was lost. I was transported back to a life I had almost completely forgotten, a life where I had been happy. I was looking at my own history, a history he had tried so hard to erase. There were black and white pictures of me, as a chubby, smiling baby with no teeth. Pictures of my parents on their wedding day, looking so impossibly young and full of a naive, shining hope that it made my heart ache. And there were hundreds of pictures of my mother. My mother, in her garden, her hands covered in dirt, smiling at a new rosebud. My mother, on a beach, squinting in the sun, her hair blowing in the wind. My mother, holding me on her hip, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated, unconditional love. And then I found it. The photograph that changed everything. The photograph that became my key, my map, my compass out of the darkness. It was a simple, candid snapshot, a little blurry, a little overexposed, taken by my father on a sunny afternoon in our backyard. I was about 10 years old. I was holding up a ridiculously large, lopsided tomato I had grown in my little patch of the garden. My hair was in messy pigtails, my front teeth were missing, and I had a triumphant, gap-toothed grin on my face that stretched from ear to ear. My mother was standing behind me, her arms wrapped around me in a tight, joyous hug, and she was laughing. Not just smiling, laughing. A full-throated, head thrown back, eyes crinkled at the corners, joyous, uninhibited laugh. It was the sound of pure delight, a sound I had not heard in 10 years, but that I could suddenly, vividly, hear in my memory, as clear as a bell. I stared at that photograph for a very long time. My fingers, smudged with dust, traced the outline of her laughing face. And as I looked at her, at the unrestrained joy in her eyes, I wasn't just seeing her happiness. I was hearing her voice. Not the imaginary, comforting voice I had summoned in my darkest hours of the night. Her real voice. The voice that had always defended me. The voice that had been my bridge to the world, my translator of love. And in my mind, I heard her say, with a clarity that was so real it made me gasp, "This is not what I wanted for you, Annie. This is not the life I wanted you to have. You were my joy, not his sorrow. You were my light. Don't let him put you out." In that moment, a profound and seismic shift happened deep within me. A tectonic plate, stuck for a decade, ground itself free with a shudder that shook my entire being. The scales, which had been so heavily weighted with his narrative, his blame, his unending grief, suddenly fell from my eyes. And I saw the truth with a clarity that was both terrifying and utterly, breathtakingly liberating. My father's cruelty was not about me. It had never been about me. I was not the cause of his pain. I was just the most convenient, most available, and safest target for it. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, and he was holding my head under the water so he could catch a breath. His abuse was not a reflection of my failings. It was a reflection of his own weakness, his own cowardice, his own profound inability to face the contents of his own broken heart. And my desperate 10-year quest to please him, to win back his love, to somehow be good enough to heal him, had been a fool's errand. I was trying to fill a hole that was bottomless. I was trying to bring a dead thing back to life. But most importantly, the most liberating truth of all, was that by submitting to his tyranny, by allowing myself to become a ghost, by trying to be the perfect, silent, grieving, invisible daughter he seemed to demand, I was not honoring my mother. I was betraying her. I was betraying the laughing, joyous, life-loving woman in that photograph. The greatest way I could possibly honor her memory was not to live a half-life in the gray shadow of her husband's grief. It was to live. To be happy. To be the smart, strong, and capable woman she had spent 15 years raising me to be. To find my own joy. The awakening was absolute. The fear, which had been my constant companion for a decade, a second skin I wore every day, was still there. It was a deep, ingrained, Pavlovian habit. But for the very first time, it was smaller than my resolve. The promise I had made to my mother at her grave had been a child's mistake, a promise made in grief and confusion. My duty was not to him. My duty was to her memory. And my most profound duty was to myself. To the girl with the gap-toothed grin and the lopsided tomato. I owed it to her to get her out of that house. I didn't say a word to him about my revelation when he came home that evening. That would have been pointless, like trying to explain the color blue to a man born blind. My plan was formed in the quiet of the dusty attic, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier time. My action would not be a confrontation. He was too strong, too loud. He would have beaten me down with words and rage. No, my escape had to be as quiet and as methodical as his abuse had been. A quiet, final, and total departure. I began to prepare. The first step was money. I had my job at the insurance office. I had been giving him most of my paycheck for household expenses, but for the past few years, I had been managing to squirrel away a few dollars every week into a secret savings account he knew nothing about. It was a tiny act of rebellion I hadn't even consciously understood at the time. It wasn't much, less than $1,000, but it was a start. It was a seed. It was my escape fund. The catalyst for my final action, the gentle push that turned my resolve into a concrete plan, came a week later from that same insurance office. One of my colleagues, a kind, gentle older woman named Margaret, was retiring. She was a woman I admired, always calm and professional. On her last day, she brought in a large map of the United States and was showing a few of us in the break room all the places she and her husband planned to visit in their new RV. She pointed to a picture of a lighthouse on the rocky coast of Maine. "That's our first stop," she said, her eyes shining. "I've always dreamed of living by the sea." I looked at the map, at all the lines and possibilities, at the vastness of the world outside my small town, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in years. A desperate, aching longing. Hope. Later that day, Margaret came over to my desk. She was holding a small, potted African violet, a retirement gift from the office. "Clara, honey," she said, her voice soft and low, so no one else could hear. "I hope you don't mind an old busybody saying so, but you seem so sad all the time. You have such a sorrow in your eyes for a young woman. Is everything all right at home, with your father?" Her simple, direct kindness caught me completely off guard. For 10 years, no one had asked. For 10 years, everyone had just assumed. And for the first time, I didn't give my usual, reflexive, "everything's fine. Thank you." I just looked at her kind, worried face, and my eyes filled with tears. I didn't have to say a word. She knew. She saw me. "My dear," she said, putting a hand on my arm, her touch warm and maternal. "My own brother went through the same terrible thing after his wife died. He was a good man, but his grief, it made him into a monster for a few years. It can make good men into monsters, but you don't have to live in his storm forever. You're allowed to find your own sunshine. Your mother would want you to have sunshine." Her words, the simple validation from a kind stranger, were the final push I needed. That weekend, I went to the library, but not for novels. I went to the reference section. I started looking at maps. I started looking at bus schedules. I decided on a place. A small coastal town in North Carolina. A place I had seen in a travel magazine. A place that was 1,000 miles and a world away from the gray, landlocked life I knew. A place with an ocean. A place where things could be washed away. I began my escape in earnest, with the quiet precision of a spy. I opened a new bank account in the next town over, and each week I would deposit a little more of my paycheck into it. I went to a second-hand store and bought 2 sturdy, anonymous suitcases. I began to pack, slowly, secretly, a few items at a time, hiding the suitcases in the back of my closet, under a pile of old winter blankets. I carefully, secretly, packed up the most precious contents of the box of photographs. I took the picture of my mother laughing. I took my parents' wedding photo. I took a picture of me and her on my first day of school. I was not just packing my clothes. I was packing my real history, the one he had tried so hard to erase. I was packing my proof that I had once been loved, that I had once been happy. I chose the day of my departure, 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday. He was going on his annual weekend fishing trip with his friends from the construction business, a ritual he never, ever missed. I played the part of the dutiful daughter one last time. I helped him pack his things. I made him his favorite breakfast, pancakes with extra bacon. I listened to him grumble about the weather, about the government, about the price of bait. I was an actress in the final scene of a long and terrible play. He stood at the door, ready to leave, tackle box in hand, smelling of coffee and Old Spice. He looked at me, a rare, almost soft expression on his face. He was thinking of the 2 days of peace he would have, away from the house, away from the memories, away from me. "You're a good girl, Clara," he said. It was the highest praise he was capable of. "You take care of the house while I'm gone." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given me in 10 years. And it was a crumb. But for the first time, I felt no desperate, Pavlovian hunger for it. I felt nothing at all. Just a deep, profound, and soul-weary pity for him. For his lonely, broken, and bitter heart. "You have a good trip, Papa," I said. And in a strange way, I meant it. I hoped he would catch a fish. I hoped he would have a moment of peace on the water. I hoped, for his sake, that he would find a way to heal. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that his healing was not my job. It never had been. The moment his old pickup truck was out of sight, the moment the sound of its rumbling engine had faded down the street, I went into action. I had already packed my 2 suitcases and hidden them by the back door. I had already written the note. It was not an angry note. It was not a hateful note. It was a note of simple, final truth. A declaration of my own independence. I placed it on the kitchen table, propped up against the sugar bowl, where he would be sure to see it when he returned on Sunday evening. Then I went to the phone. I called a taxi. I took my 2 suitcases and my small, precious box of photographs, and I walked out the front door of that house, the house I had grown up in, the only home I had ever known, for the last time. I did not look back. I could not look back. The past was a pillar of salt, and I was running for my life, toward the sunshine. The note I left for him on that polished oak kitchen table was the most difficult and the most honest piece of writing I have ever produced. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times in the days leading up to my departure. I filled pages of a notebook with angry drafts, with sorrowful drafts, with pleading drafts. But in the end, I threw them all away. I realized that anger and sorrow and pleading were all part of the conversation he had been dictating for a decade. My final words to him needed to be in a new language, a language that was entirely my own. The final note was short. It was calm. It was resolute. I have it memorized. I can see it now, leaning against the ceramic sugar bowl, catching the afternoon light. It said, "Papa, I am leaving. I have spent the last 10 years trying to be a replacement for the woman you lost, and I have failed. I see now that it was an impossible task. No one could ever replace her. She was the sun. And in trying to be her, in trying to fill the hole she left in your life, I have lost myself. I have become a ghost in my own home. I have finally realized that the best way to honor Mama's memory is not to live as a shadow in your grief, but to live the happy, full life she always wanted for me. I am going to find my own sunshine. I hope, one day, you can find a way to live with your grief that doesn't involve destroying what is left of her daughter. I forgive you for your pain, and I am letting you go. Goodbye, Clara. I took a long, roundabout bus journey that felt like a passage through a strange liminal space between 2 lives. It was a 3-day trip that carried me through landscapes I had only ever seen in books, a slow, rumbling journey away from the gray, claustrophobic world I had known, and toward an unknown, terrifying, and hopeful future. When I finally arrived in that small North Carolina town, the first thing I did was walk to the ocean. I took off my shoes and walked into the surf, letting the cold, salty water wash over my ankles. The air smelled of salt and life and possibility, and I wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of a release so profound it felt like a physical unburdening. The first few years were hard. I won't lie or romanticize it. They were achingly lonely. I had to build a life, an entire self, from scratch at 25 years old, with very little money and a heart that was a latticework of scar tissue. I found a small, shabby but clean apartment over a bookstore. The smell of old paper and binding glue that wafted up through the floorboards was a comfort to me. I got a job as a secretary in a small, quiet lawyer's office. The work was methodical and logical, and I found a strange peace in the orderliness of it. For a long time, I was haunted. I was haunted by my past, by the ghost of my father's anger and the precious, painful ghost of my mother's love. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap with a familiar, sickening dread. Every time I heard a heavy footstep behind me on the street, my shoulders would instinctively hunch, bracing for a blow that was only in my memory. I had to teach myself how to live without fear. I had to learn how to take up space in the world. I had to learn that my own opinions were valid, that my own tastes were acceptable, that my own needs mattered. It was a slow, painstaking process of self-reclamation. But for the first time in a decade, I was free. The silence in my little apartment was not the heavy, oppressive, judgmental silence of my father's house. It was a peaceful silence. It was my silence, and I could fill it with whatever I chose. I filled it with music, the classical music my mother had loved. I filled it with the scent of flowers from the farmer's market. I filled it with the quiet, happy sound of my own reading, late into the night. I was learning to be my own companion, and I found that I was, in fact, quite good company. The consequence for my father was the one thing he had unknowingly and relentlessly engineered for himself over 10 long years: absolute and total loneliness. He was left in that big empty house with nothing but the ghosts of the 2 women he had, in his own tragic way, driven away. He called me once, about a month after I had left. He had somehow gotten my new number from my old workplace. I had foolishly left a forwarding address. He was drunk. His voice was a terrible mixture of rage and a pathetic, pleading self-pity. He screamed at me. He threatened me. He begged me to come home. He told me I was an ungrateful child, a terrible daughter, that I had abandoned him in his time of need. I listened, calmly, without interrupting. I let him exhaust his rage and his sorrow into the phone line. I heard it all for what it was, the desperate, dying roar of a man who had lost control. When he had finally exhausted himself, when there was nothing left but his ragged, painful, whiskey-soaked breathing on the other end of the line, I said, very quietly, my voice steady and clear, "Goodbye, Papa," and I hung up the phone. I changed my number the next day. I never spoke to him again. The full and final resolution of our story, the epilogue I never knew I needed, came almost 20 years later. I was 45 years old. I had a life, a good one, a life I had built with my own 2 hands. I had met and married a kind, gentle man, a professor at the local college, a man who was nothing like my father, a man who loved my quiet nature and encouraged my voice. I had 2 wonderful children of my own, a son and a daughter. I was happy, genuinely, peacefully happy. Then one day, a thick, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. It was from a law firm in my old hometown. My father had passed away from a heart attack, alone in that big, silent house. He had left the house and his entire, surprisingly modest estate to me, his only child. Tucked inside the legal documents was a sealed, personal letter, addressed to me in his shaky, spidery handwriting, the handwriting of a very old, very sick man. My hands trembled as I opened it. I was terrified of what it might contain. More blame, more anger, but it was none of those things. The letter was not an apology. He was not a man capable of apologies. His pride was too deeply ingrained. But it was, in its own way, a confession, a final accounting, a white flag of surrender waved from beyond the grave. He wrote about my mother. He wrote about how she was the sun in his sky, the anchor of his world, the translator of his own heart, and how, when she died, he was plunged into a darkness so profound, so complete, that he didn't know how to escape it. And then he wrote the words that finally, after 30 years, set me completely free. He wrote, "I looked at you and I saw her, but you were not her, and the anger I had at God for taking her from me, and anger I was too cowardly to face. I put it on you. It was a terrible thing. It was wrong. I know that now. I have been a lonely man for a long time. It is what I deserved. The house is yours. Do with it what you will. I hope you have been happy, Clara. Your mother would have wanted that. I cried when I read that letter. I cried for the lonely, broken man he had become, a man trapped for decades in the prison of his own making. I cried for the 15-year-old girl who had endured so much, who had blamed herself for so long. And I cried for the mother who had loved us both so fiercely, and whose love, in the end, was the thing that saved me. I sold the house. I never set foot in it again. I used the money to pay off the mortgage on my own family's home and to set up college funds for my own children. I used it to finally put the past to rest, to wash it away for good. The lesson I learned, the one that took me a painful decade of my youth to understand, is this: you are not, and can never be, responsible for another person's grief. You cannot carry it for them. You cannot heal it for them. It is their journey, their burden to bear. And you must never, ever allow yourself to become the scapegoat for their pain. It is a fire that will consume you both. I also learned that honoring the memory of someone you love is not about staying trapped in the past with their other loved ones in a shared misery. It is about carrying their light, their love, and their hopes for you forward into your own future. You honor the dead, not by ceasing to live, but by living fully, by choosing joy, by seeking out the sunshine. My advice to you, to anyone who is dealing with a loved one who is lashing out from a place of unbearable grief and pain, is this: protect your own heart first. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You can have immense compassion for their pain without accepting their abuse. You must draw a line in the sand, not out of anger, but out of a profound and radical act of love. A love for them, yes, the kind of love that refuses to enable their self-destruction. But more importantly, a love for yourself. You are not a vessel for their sorrow. You are a life waiting to be lived. And you have a right to your own sunshine. Thank you for walking with me through this long and painful memory. To speak it all, from beginning to end, feels like I have finally put down the heaviest bag I have ever carried in my life. The story is no longer trapped inside me, a silent, screaming ghost. It is outside, and I am free of it. The house of my past has no more power over me. If this story found a small echo in your own heart, if it brought you some small measure of understanding or peace, please share it. It might be the permission slip someone else needs to finally put down their own heavy bag and walk away toward their own life. And please don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Love, Grandma Clara. See you in the next story.